My name is Laolu Davies-Yemitan, and you're listening to My Brother Podcast.
It's incredible that in 2020, in the midst of a pandemic, we're still able to telecommunicate essentially. This podcast, for example, will be one form of telecommunication. And that's because of advancements that we've made in technology. The rapid pace at which technology has changed, particularly over the last few decades, has been tremendous. My guest today has been on the forefront of a lot of that change, that evolutionary change that we've all endured, and the revolutionary change that's happening right before our face today. Kenneth Frank is a long time executive in the technology space, and I'm so delighted to have you today. Kenny, why don't you start out by just sharing with our audience a little bit about your background, where you're from, and sort of how you arrived at this point in life?
That's a long story. um, but yeah, just a little bit about me. Interesting enough, I was born in Corvallis, Oregon, which when I say that to people, they always bat an eyes, like they can't believe black folks have are from Oregon. Actually, my mom's from Portland, and my dad grew up in Seattle, even though he was born in New Orleans. But I was born in Corvallis because he was actually going to school for his master's and eventually his PhD at Oregon State in Corvallis. That's the reason I was there. My brother and my sister were born there as well. My older brother was born in Seattle. So Oregon is where it started. But very soon after he graduated, he moved the whole family to New Jersey. My dad, back in the late 60s, early 70s, went to go work for Bell Laboratories, AT&T Bell Laboratories back in the day, and there were a lot of us there. So we spent a number of years in New Jersey. Then eventually transitioned to Chicago. Life happens. Parents got divorced, and so my dad moved to Chicago. We went back to Oregon, and then eventually we all kind of got to Chicago, but kind of in a split family scenario. So I consider myself from Chicago because those were my formative years. In all parts of Chicago, South Side, a place called Our Lady of Peace on near 77th and Blackstone, South Side. Remember that experience. Lived in other parts, Evanston, north side of Chicago as well. And eventually went on, because of my dad, quite frankly, in his background, he was doing his PhD in electrical engineering. And I saw him, kind of through his career, like most kids wanting to emulate their father, really got focused on, math, science, and engineering at a very young age. And I was pretty, proficient in it just through school. And so there's a lot of little sub stories there that maybe you'll get a chance to get to, but wanted to go off to, the best engineering school. But those that grew up in Chicago know that if you're from Chicago and you've experienced the cold in Chicago, you have an objective to get out of the cold. So besides University of Illinois, Urbana, which I applied to and got into, I only applied to schools in Florida and California to kind of go to the warm. The University of Southern California, which was a good engineering program, good enough to be in LA, and kind of started, went through there as a computer science major. And I'd been working at Bell Labs quite, during, summer internships, even back into high school, that really kind of got me into the computer science realm. So as I kind of went into computer science in the kind of mid 80s, which, was probably a little earlier than most. I really came in there with a head of steam because I had already, had so much, industrial experience that really felt like I knew what my game plan was. I went there through undergrad. I went to go work for AT&T Bell Laboratories as well after undergrad, and then immediately went off and got my grad degree at Stanford University, also in computer science, and then just did a number of things in the field, in the technology field, predominantly in telecom in the first part of my career, and now in software and enterprise software in the kind of the second half of my career. So that's really the thumbnail journey. There's a lot of details in the nooks and crannies of that story, but That's the high level elevator pitch.
I can certainly appreciate that, and you put it so succinctly, just like an engineer would. So it's got to be. I'm quite fascinated by this, right? You're raised in Oregon, you wind up in Chicago, and you're a sophomore in high school already working at Bell Labs. Can you share a bit of what perhaps your high school experience must have been like? I got to think that took some initiative, some maturity to be already sort of in a work environment while just a sophomore in high school.
Yeah, it was interesting. I wish I could say that it was some profound strategy, but for me, it was I could make more money doing the internship at Bell Labs and at the time Naperville, Illinois, than I could, working at some other remedial, job. And so I think that whole linkage of understanding, okay, I could go work at a McDonald's, I can go work at, I think my friends worked at an elderly care home, for something slightly, more than minimum wage perhaps, versus going and working at Bell Labs and kind of getting the pay that I was getting, which was 2 or 3x of what they were doing for the same work, or for this, quite frankly, probably less laborious work, but also learning at the same time. I think that was kind of the early understanding of what highly skilled jobs and kind of the flexibility and the value they bring to the table, and why getting an education and getting skilled was so critical at a young age. But I did go there, and you learn. I mean, you go there, and if you're quick, I was learning to program in C, and I understood Unix at a very early age. These are advanced tools and technologies, operating systems and such, and then you go and kind of work and do some of those coursework in high school and undergrad, and it's almost remedial, relative to what I was doing, at the workplace. And so it did give me one, the perspective I talked about, but also just a set of skill sets and understanding kind of what that environment really was, at the workplace. It wasn't some hypothetical or abstract concept to me. I understood what the linkage was.
Yeah, certainly. So what was the transition like from Chicago going all the way down to Southern California? Where they claim it never rains, but I swear I've been there a time or two where it's actually been raining.
Yeah, but it's all right. It'll stop, and it's a beautiful place after it stops, but it does rain. But I always laugh because and this is a whole generational thing. I have 3 kids, and I've done the whole experience of dropping them off at school, and it seems like all 5 of us, my wife and the other kids, we all go and go through this elaborate process to get them put in their dorm or apartment, and making 5 trips to Target and Costco, and getting everything they would ever need for that experience. My experience going off to California was very different. I remember going to Chicago O'Hare Airport, and I had one of those old trunks, the big trunks that you had, that I pretty much packed my life. And I got dropped off at the curb at O'Hare. They didn't park the car. They didn't walk me into, this is before security. All right. They just dropped me off at the curb and said, "Good luck, son. You're going to be all right." I had never been to LA in my life. I'm 17 years old going off to college. So I was younger than most. And I just showed up. I had no dormitory because, the housing situation at USC was pretty bad. So, they put you up in some temporary setup until they can find you a place. But it was completely unknown to me. And I enjoyed that, quite frankly. I think that, it's kind of a parody for life, is that, when you take those chances and you go, into the unknown, by definition, you're gonna expand your thought process. You're gonna expand, your comfort zone. And I truly enjoyed that. It was probably the best decision I had ever made in terms of, friends and relationships and kind of the opportunities that afforded me, quite frankly, from where I've done.
And how did you select your major there? And what was your overall experience like in terms of the academics? What organizations might you have been involved with while you were an undergrad?
Yeah, so I was, it was kind of interesting. I went there to get into engineering and computer science. I'd already known what I wanted to do going in there. So it wasn't me going there and then figuring out what my major was. I came in there kind of with a running start. I'd actually taken a bunch of AP classes, and that's why I kind of, you already had credits going in there. So, the engineering school at USC was way off on one side of campus. And there weren't too many of us on that side of campus. I mean, you go to, school policy, public relations, all these communications, all these other places, you have a number of us, and those were more central to campus. And so I always found myself, going to my engineering classes and then running back to kind of where the heart of the campus was, where all the social activities were. But, got involved pretty quickly. I ended up pledging a fraternity. I pledged Kappa Alpha Psi, my second semester, freshman year, pretty young. We actually had a house on campus, a Kappa house on Fraternity Row with, all the predominantly white sororities and fraternities. We were the only black one on there, and we had a lot of experiences, doing that. Made a lot of money because we, do these big parties and that sort of thing. And so, it was a great social and educational experience, being at USC. I mean, it's not a school that, was double-digit percentage black. I mean, there's probably 3 or 4% of us, but we were very, very tight. I mean, you go, pretty much everybody knows everybody that was there during that time. They stayed pretty tight even today, and it was just a great experience. To be out there in California, during those days.
So as your college career winds down, you're getting your degree. What happens next? What was the transition from undergrad? So
from undergrad, I was still part of the AT&T system. Actually, I was on there. I went there, on a full ride with AT&T. They actually gave me a full ride, and I had to maintain a certain GPA during that. I will give a bit of a side note, which is kind of funny. I told you a little bit about my dad, but when you get a full ride to go to USC and your dad and your parents don't have to pay for it, they're pretty happy. But I had to maintain a certain GPA, and freshman year I do real well, 3.6, 3.7, something like that. And second semester I told you I pledged. The GPA went down dramatically, as you could probably imagine. And back then you didn't get the grades electronically. The grades actually got shipped to your home address. I remember going back home for kind of that summer, and I saw an envelope on the in the living room in the middle of the little console there, and I'm like, yeah, I think those are my grades. And my dad had gotten them, and you could tell that the envelope had been opened already, right? And so he pulls me in there. And he goes, what happened? And I said, well, Dad, just got defocused a little bit, and I got involved with, this fraternity. Then he jumped in and he says, that goddamn Kappa apple pie, or whatever the hell that shit is, you better get your stuff together. And so it was like, yeah. So that was. I had a great experience, but as I kind of got my act together and got back on track, I was very motivated to say, okay, I'm with this AT&T, scholarship. It pretty much guarantees me a job after I'm done, with school. And Bell Labs at the time was the place to be for, anybody in the technology area. And so I did that, and they immediately sent me off to grad school. So it was literally I worked the summer, and then, they shipped me off to grad school, and I had choices of where I wanted to go, but wanted to stay west. But and Stanford always was that place that called me. I mean, something about that place just was always mesmerized me, and had an opportunity to go there and do the master's program in computer science there. So had that transition where I did that in a year, got my master's in about a year, and then went back to Bell Labs, where I started my career, for the first 4 or 5 years before I went down to Atlanta, which we'll go into later. But it was an interesting time then, because this was 89, 90. And this is right when a lot of the change in Silicon Valley started happening. And so, you had a lot of the traditional companies, like what I worked for, Bell Labs, you had Hewlett Packard, you had digital equipment. You have all these, I call legacy companies. And then you had the emergence of Cisco, some of the, kind of up and coming companies that were there. I mean, and then Stanford is sitting right there. So you have the guys that started Yahoo, were kind of in research assistants there. So just so much was going on at the beginning of that whole kind of internet technology application boom that was starting to happen at that time. Sometimes I wonder whether I should have jumped on that bandwagon because they came after a lot of us who were at Stanford. But you kind of looked at it and said, well, no, I got the sure thing with Bell Labs. I'm going to go ahead and do that. It worked out, but I mean, it's just you always wonder, right? You always wonder what would have happened if you had taken that other path at that particular window. And it's something I do continue to think about. But that was that transition. So go back to to Bell Labs after my master's program, and got into kind of the heart of telecom. I mean, we started doing some of the first programmable, telecom services, started opening up, services like calling name delivery, and, all as telecom started getting more interesting, kind of more software oriented, that's when I started getting involved, and that became, a great opportunity for me to kind of get in there and really start doing some interesting things.
Yeah, so it's, you have sort of a rather unique journey. I mean, my wife runs a STEM organization, and she talks about when she was a science teacher in high school, Yates High School here in Houston, they had these co-op programs that allow students to actually work, for a couple of hours a day or however it worked. And so a number of her students who didn't end up going to college, they've been able to build these successful careers because they have that entry level opportunity. They got in so early. Your journey is one where you latch on through this, early internship, and you continue to grow through there. So, typically I'd ask, well, what were the first 4 to 5 years of working full time were like? But you were already sort of within the culture. So what was that a common theme with your colleagues at the time when you started your, let's call it your professional leg of your career? With
no, it wasn't. I mean, I even talk to people now. It's a unique situation. I mean, I don't know too many others that, by the time they went and started school. I mean, I had literally interned 6 different summers before I started full time after my undergraduate degree, and people kind of say, well, how did you move from technology to management and leadership? Why don't you write code anymore? And I remember when I first got to with my first experiences. Every summer you do something, and as you got in the system, you could help orchestrate what you did the next summer. And I remember the first summer I was doing some kind of quality QA work where you're assessing people's code, right? You're checking for bugs, you're checking for problem code, and started doing that. And quite frankly, by the time the summer was ended, I was out there critiquing these software developers, saying, if you had written your code like this, you'd make my job easier and you'd improve the quality of the program, and started critiquing, right? So next summer I said, well, I'm not going to be in QA anymore. I'm going to go become one of the software developers to show them how it's done. So then became a software developer, right? And then when I was a software developer, I remember there was somebody feeding me input, which was, at the time, they called system engineers. These are people that write requirements that you have to write code to. And so then I start critiquing them and start saying, hey, if you wrote better requirements, we could do things more efficiently in the software side, okay? And every one of these resources, the system engineer may drive a dozen developers, and a dozen developers may drive a whole lot more QA people. And so there's this leverage, structure, there that you kept wanting to get to the front of the food chain. And you kept, I started realizing very early as a very young person, let me get in front of the food chain. Let me go to where the strategic decisions are getting made, because I know that I can influence a bigger system when I went ahead and did that. And so the thing that internship experience allowed me to do is kind of fast forward a lot of that learning that probably would have taken me 5 years to do. And I would have had to navigate, how it is once you kind of start something permanently, unlike an internship where you can kind of jump around and get these experiences, full-time employee, you don't have as much of that flexibility. So it allowed me to fast forward that and then understand myself as well, just to say, okay, where is my natural, place in this hierarchy? And don't put myself so far deep in the hierarchy that I can't influence, the direction of the business. Now I'm a young engineer and that sort of thing, probably, a little too cocky at the time, but nonetheless, I mean, I kind of understood that phenomena and wanted to fast forward it, pretty aggressively. And I think I was able to go ahead and do that.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like you did. So you're moving up the chain. What led to the decision that took you down to Atlanta? What was that position, and why did you choose to, I guess, make that step at the time?
So I was at Bell Labs, and we were, it was called, part of Bell Labs called AT&T Network Systems, and had a really, really vibrant, African American population there. I mean, they were pretty active actually back in the 80s, probably more active than they were in the 90s and early 2000s. But
and this was in California.
This was actually in Naperville, Illinois. So the AT&T, this division, they're kind of the Bell Labs division. They were predominantly in Naperville and New Jersey. There was a few other satellite organizations, but those are the two major locations. So was there doing that, started working on something called the 5ESS. It's a switching system. It's a telephone switching system. So all the calls that, managing all the calls that go back and forth. I mean, this stuff still exists in the networks today. It was built so well that they don't depreciate. They don't actually go down, and they don't have to be replaced. Is probably one of the problems with the unit, and how it couldn't keep making money, because they sold stuff that didn't need to be replaced at some point. So I was doing that and started realizing, at the time my world was in the switching system. You tell me anything about the switching system, the architecture, where the software sat, how it worked. I was an expert, but then I started getting exposure to this switching system is just part of a bigger ecosystem that I don't know anything about. Okay. And I started trying to understand, okay, what outside of this switching system do I need to understand? Do I need to understand, the issues of transmission, of software, of, services, of operations, of, consumer marketing, all the things that started, that were much broader than what I was doing. I realized that I was never going to get there, from where I was sitting, in kind of an equipment manufacturer role. So I started getting real good in a particular technology where I started going down to, going to see operators. So I started to go see, Verizon. Before Verizon, it was Pac Bell, it was Bell South, it was Bell Atlantic, it was all the different, companies, selling what we do as a switching system, starting to get to know a lot of these customers, which gave me some of that exposure I referenced. And two things hit me when I went to Atlanta to go see Bell South. One was this phenomena around understanding there's a bigger world than what I was working on. And then secondly, living in Naperville, Illinois, which is a western suburb of Chicago, where there weren't a whole lot of us there. I go to Atlanta, and a friend of mine, drives me around and brings me to some areas in Southwest Atlanta, the Cascades and some other areas. And I'm sitting there saying, hey, how many black people live here? And they said, it's all black. And it's the first time I've ever seen in my life a upper middle class black community. And I was just having my first child at the time, and all that came together. I mean, the professional interest, my drive to kind of raise my daughter in an environment that was a little more healthy for her, wanting to be personally, my wife and I, in an environment that was more healthy for us. All that came together, which said it was the right time to move to Atlanta and experience that. And it was a great experience. I mean, being in that area, and then transitioning to Bell South at the time, where I got a whole set of other experiences in technology that were much broader than what I was doing before.
Can you share some of what those experiences were?
So we started getting into a lot of business services development. We called it Advanced Intelligent Network, but probably the area that I really kind of made a big transition at Bell South in was when I started. I was one of the first few people that started working on DSL. We call it digital subscriber line, and this is back in the this is mid 90s. Most folks remember mid 90s. We talk about how the pace of technology changed. But most people were using modems at the time. They were using AOL.
Absolutely, remember AOL,
MindSpring, and all these other tools, right? Earthlink, and whoever, depending on where you lived in the country. And And there was this technology called DSL, ADSL, which used copper lines to send higher speed data services over. But the technology was originally oriented around video distribution. So, the notion of the internet wasn't really big at the time. It was, how do you distribute video efficiently? Switch video, right, is what everybody was really excited about. And I started looking at that technology, and some others started looking at that and said, really, we can go and run a data service over this. At the time, it was something called ATM, asynchronous transfer mode, but it was a data technology over it that can actually be a feeder into, the internet. And we started working on that very early. And so I switched from, traditional, telecom to kind of data networking, during that time, and got really good at it. We actually wrote a bunch of standards, to go and really show how we can use that technology for the internet, and became one of the few people around, the experts, and on that particular technology. Every time we kind of had big strategic meetings, I'd always get a phone call and have to go up to where, the big conference rooms where all the executives were sitting at, who had no idea what we were getting into, but I was the guy who would represent what, this is what we should be doing. And really, that really kind of started the acceleration of my career, quite frankly, moving from a great individual contributor to somebody that, started having some pretty significant influence on, corporate strategy and other things. And that's when things kind of really started taking off for me.
Yeah. Now, I know, looking back in hindsight, did you have a sense of what the power of technology could be? I mean, I'm thinking in the mid-90s, I remember we had AOL. There was a, slow dial-up process, and then you heard that little chime. And then it was like, if you had AOL, you had email. And that was like, you were way out ahead of the game if you had email in 96. So at that point in your career, did you have a sense of, man, there are these possibilities that lie ahead if we just harness them? I mean, I think an example is you looking at copper, wiring, and saying, we could run data over that.
So I think so. We it's kind of interesting. You mentioned that, and let's fast forward to something I had done, much later in my career. But I was running around at that time, pushing not just DSL from an access mechanism. We call it access because it's between the consumer and the network, but also within the network, how to move the network to an all IP infrastructure as well, and looking at all the sets of services, in all different parts of the economy, whether it's entertainment, education, commerce, you name it, what can run over that infrastructure, and really change business models. Now, did I know, what would things look like in 2020? No, but the concepts of, there being kind of a common, IP, it wasn't even IP at the time, it was as another technology, but kind of a common data infrastructure that, multiple services can run over, that was born way back in those times because we were really espousing them. So we did have at least directionally, we saw where this could go. Now, exactly how it was going to get there, still took a lot of different turns that, none of us could have predicted precisely. But I think directionally, we kind of had a sense for where, what the possibilities were, right? I'm going to jump over a few experiences, but, one of my later experiences, I moved up the ladder and, did what I did at Alcatel Lucent, running a division with, 4,000 or 5,000 people and multiple $1 billion of P&L and a bunch of stuff. We'll kind of go through all that kind of stuff. But, there was I was out there espousing some of the same concepts, but in, much more granular ways, with a lot more, current technology under my belt, across the world, including India, where, I was doing this presentation in India around how these networks are really application frameworks. They're not, they're not just built for data and voice communications anymore. They're built for, driving commerce and industry. And I was doing this talk in Mumbai. And I'm about to get on the airplane. If you ever flew back from Mumbai, either back to Europe or whatever, the flights usually leave like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So we have a dinner. We're kind of headed to the airport. I get a phone call that says, we want you to spend another night in Mumbai. And I'm just like, I'm exhausted at this point. I mean, India and Mumbai especially can be very exhausting. And I'm like, well, why do you want me to spend another night? And he said, well, we walked through your presentation with Mukesh Ambani here in Mumbai, and he wants to meet you. And do you know who Mukesh Ambani is?
You know who he is. I've been reading about him.
So Mukesh Ambani, now I think he's in the top 10 richest people in the world. And he had just purchased an all 4G license across India, and didn't know what to do with it, but didn't have the business case to go and just build a communications network with his 4G license. He wanted to build something, far more strategic. And so he's holding on to these licenses, and he gets a wind of my, kind of my strategy and my, what I'm espousing. And I go meet Mukesh and his right-hand guy, Manoj Modi. And I mean, we just hit it off. I mean, what they're trying to do, what I'm trying to do, he goes, Kenny, I want you to come to Mumbai. I want you to come to Mumbai. I want you to bring as many, people to Mumbai that can help build what you're describing in Mumbai. I have the licenses. I have the money. Let's do it. And I still have this big job at Alcatel Lucent. But my passion is sitting there saying, okay, I have somebody who has the vision and the wherewithal to actually build what I'm saying. And it was exactly the same thing I was doing at Bell South, just at a very different level. But fast forward to this, almost doing exactly the same thing, but at very different terms and very different scale. With one of the kind of top industry people in the world there, and spent a year and a half in Mumbai helping to build it. And now it's called Jio, J-I-O. All you do is go and Google search it. Like literally right now in the last month and a half, probably every private equity firm, I think Facebook just put $1 billion into it. I mean, I'm talking, I think they've raised something on the order of 10 to 15 billion in the last 2 months, going and funding Jio, because it's already disrupted the market in India for what it's become. And it was, in my view, it started with that, conversation. Now, would they have built something else that still had made the difference? They could have, but that architecture was the architecture we espoused. And a bunch of us, went there and actually, helped really set that up. And so, those are where these connections actually happen, right? You did something very early in your career that just manifests itself later in your career, and you could never predict that. It's just, you couldn't find the thread between those two things, naturally until you look from a hindsight perspective. Just really interesting side note.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know that you ended up taking on this big role at Alcatel Lucent, but take us between Bell South and Alcatel Lucent. There were some steps along the way, and it wasn't always rosy.
Yeah. So at Bell South, I told you I moved into the data side. It was very well liked at Bell South. They put me in the leadership development program. Got my first couple promotions there. They started trying to put me around the company to get different operational responsibilities. Sent me off and got my MBA. So I went to Emory and got my MBA during that time period. And I just remember one time being in the office. There's an office mate of mine. We still had 2-person offices back then. And this guy would always bring his lunch, his bag lunch to the office to save money, right? I mean, he didn't want to go out to lunch. He wanted to save money and bring his lunch to the office. And I always thought that was kind of strange. He's making decent money. Why is he doing that? So he leaves like in 97, 98. And about a year after he left, he comes back into town. He moved up to Boston. He comes back in town and he's worth $15 million all of a sudden, because he went to go work for, one of these startups in Boston that, goes IPO, and, he's worth all this money in that, literally that time, 12 months. He comes and he brings me out to a drink. Now he's not bringing his little bag lunch anymore. Now he takes me out to lunch. And he says, Kenny, you got to get out of there. He says, him and I were the ones that are always competing for the top slot in the organization. And he goes, you need to get out of there. And he says, there's too much out there that, could leverage you, and you need to do it. And so there's a guy that I met He was a guy that worked at UUNet, a guy named Johnson Agrawal. Became one of my really, really close friends. Him and I worked on some things on DSL, the DSL forum, the standards bodies, got to know each other pretty well. And he had hooked up with Kleiner Perkins, and they were going to go create a company called Broadband Office, which basically took a lot of the real estate investment trust building assets, and we were going to build a network that goes into their buildings and provide services to tenants in those buildings. And they had raised a bunch of money, and 5 of us became the founding management team of Broadband Office. And I literally picked up in a moment's notice. A really senior executive at Bell South was just literally bringing me into his office to tell me what my next role was going to be. And before he could get it out of his mouth, I told him, I said, Bill, before you go on, I'm leaving the company. I'm going to go do this startup. And I'm really excited about it. And he's just in shock that I'm going to be leaving the company. And so I go and I move to the DC area to go start this company called Broadband Office. And it was the most exciting thing I'd ever done in my career. It was also the most disappointing thing in that, the dot-com bubble burst in 2001, 2002, and all the funding dried up. But we also built it to about 800 employees between 99 and 2001. Had the time of my life. We sat there and built a team that would literally compete with any team I've ever worked with in my entire life or ever seen in my entire life. And we did some pretty tremendous things with new technology, and it was in an environment where you're at Bell South, you're at other places where all the infrastructure is there. When you found a company early on like that, there is no infrastructure. There's no network, there's no email system, there's no processes, there's no financial systems, there's nothing. I mean, you're just showing up at an office. Quite frankly, the only office we had was it was called the Toilet Bowl Building in Tyson's Corner, Virginia. It was behind the TGI Fridays. It was an old storage facility that they cleared out because space was such a premium at that time. We couldn't get space quickly. And so every morning we had to walk, by the garbage from last night's TGI Friday and smell it. So I go from Bell South, where I got the big mahogany office, to walking by smelling garbage every morning, but did that startup and grew it and built the processes, built the products, built the team, built the system, scaled it to become a global enterprise, negotiated significant deals that were the 9-digit deals. We're just doing crazy things that I never thought I would be able to do. I wouldn't have been able to do at Bell South or AT&T. In my role, and that became a great experience. But at the same time, you start realizing that you got to be funded, and our sponsors were saying scale the business. Hey, we can our peers were going IPO and at high valuations. We were the best of the peer group. We hadn't got IPO yet, so all that was going great. We're in the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Just a lot of great things, but then the bubble burst. And when the bubble burst, it burst quick. And so all the fun going up, we had to deal with bridge loan finance people and everything else going down. And but the assets of that company ended up becoming a company called Masergy, which actually still in existence. They have all of our intellectual property. I actually transitioned, with a bunch of my team over to that new company as we kind of went through the asset sale during that period. And that company still actually is thriving pretty much, in the space, using a lot of the core technology that we had. And that's when I actually transitioned over to Alcatel, maybe about a year after that experience, and became their chief technology officer and started getting into a brand new area when I went to Alcatel, which was the IPTV arena. So if you know Uverse, the AT&T getting into video, I was on the forefront of that. So throughout this career, just as you kind of see things, I was always kind of doing what I call the bleeding edge opportunity. So it was data networking, it was intelligent networking, it was this multi-services architecture, it's venture capital based companies, and then I go to Alcatel and I'm sitting there doing video over a telecom network, to compete with the DirecTVs and the cable companies, to get AT&T and Verizon into those businesses, and really hit it off there and did some pretty tremendous things. we call it with UVerse and IPTV. They call it Lightspeed was the internal project name, but controlled all of that, built that project, for AT&T, and expanded that across a number of other, carriers, globally, and did really well there. And you know how it works when you deliver, and that was a multi-billion-dollar project for Alcatel. That set me up really well for taking on bigger and better things. And then we ended up merging with Lucent, and Lucent was the old Bell Labs that I used to work for before I went to Bell South. And so it became full circle. And so, by the time I go work for Lucent, I'm running a pretty big division at Alcatel. It merges in, I get all these employees. And funny enough, my first boss, when I, left undergrad, I'm sitting there looking at my new employee list at the merger, and my first boss is actually in the organization that I've inherited. The first phone call I made was to her and said, Barbara, hey, you're back together again. And I was so humble. I was probably 3 or 4 levels above her at the time. I still revered her as my first boss because, she taught me so many things. It's just a big story. So just went through that transition at Lucent and just learned a lot. It just kept moving up.
And so at this point, how many people are you managing?
Oh, man, just depending on the time. IPTV, I was probably managing about 1,000 people. Then I started running, the professional services division globally, which is probably about 2,500. And then when we merged with Lucent, I ended up taking the job of president solutions and marketing, where we had all the LTE infrastructure underneath me, all the software, all the integration services. And it had to be somewhere in the 5,000 to 6,000 range at the time. Probably about a $4 to $5 billion P&L, depending on how you count it. And so that's when they actually moved me to France. So I actually moved to Paris. I reported directly to the CEO of Alcatel Lucent. So everything was at the time headquartered in Paris at the time. So, packed with the family and moved to France for 5 years. And
how hard was it to convince your wife of that move?
You know what? If she had known we were going for 5 years, it would have been harder. I think the idea was that we're going to go for a couple of years. It turned to 5. But yeah, no, everybody was. It wasn't like trying to move to Mumbai or something like that. It wasn't that hard of a sell. The issue for us was our kids. My 2 youngest sons. I had 3 kids. I have 3 kids. A daughter who's the oldest, and 2 younger sons. My daughter was in her junior year of high school, and so just the timing of that became a challenge. But then she accelerated things and ended up graduating in 3 years. And we had the choice at 16 whether to send her off to college, or I convinced her to say, come to Paris with us and just enjoy life for a year in Paris. Go to the American school in Paris, and you don't have to take any hard classes because you already got accepted into, college. So just come with us and defer the enrollment. She ended up doing that, but still did a bunch of, international baccalaureate classes and all that. But yeah, getting the family moved there. But the kids, my sons hadn't started high school yet, so they actually went through high school in Paris, and it was a great experience for them. It was a great experience for my wife and I. I consider Paris my second home. I get there and just, you know so many people, and you know the city. It's very different than a touristy perspective of the city. I know that pretty well.
And I can't help it. Parlez-vous français?
Ah, je parle plus français, mais c'est difficile pour moi.
No, I did get to, in my background, I own a wine bar at one point. I sold it last year. So I did spend some time in France in 2017. It was just a phenomenal experience.
Oh, okay.
Being in the villages. But back to your career, because
since you know wine, and like I said, I like to go off these tangents, so I hope you appreciate that as an interview. But when we came back from France, I got into wine pretty significantly, and you get these big containers to go back home.
Yeah.
Right? And I get this big container, and I get a reefer, which is a refrigerated container, and I put 2,500 bottles of French wine on it. And I told my wife, I said, whatever other furniture and household goods can fit on there after the wine can come. Everything else we're selling. So I actually brought that back with me when I came back to the States, and so I'm still consuming that wine. So I'm a big wine guy. Yeah. So if you're ever in the Dallas area, I must entertain you.
We'll be glad to indulge you, my brother. Thank you. So you spent 5 years with Alcatel Lucent. What was that role like? And I know it's during that time that you end up with this introduction to Mukesh Ambani.
Yeah. So yeah, as I got into the solutions and marketing world and looking at, really how to push, Alcatel Lucent in terms of its portfolio and its offer, kind of away from just pure equipment sales into what we call solutions, which are, how to truly transform, our customers' businesses, is really what I focused on. That's what got me the intro to Mukesh, and ended up starting a joint venture with him. In addition to my other responsibilities, a joint venture where, I brought a bunch of talent into Mumbai, from all over the world in very specialized skills. Everybody but me moved there. I couldn't talk my wife into moving to Mumbai, but I basically, spent 3 weeks there and came back for a long weekend and spent another 3 weeks there for about a year and a half, and really helped them from the beginning build that infrastructure, through a joint venture.
Okay, with your employer at the time?
Yeah. So I talked to my CEO, Ben Verwaayen, who's the CEO at Alcatel at the time. He had constantly wanted to get into India and get into Mukesh, but he couldn't figure out how to do it. So he saw this as an opportunity, when I hit it off with him. And so I orchestrated that. Mukesh wanted me to come work for him. I said, as a Black American, I don't see myself being, working in India for a long period of time. But I love what you're doing. Let me figure out how to make this happen. And so the agreement was that I would, become the head of a joint venture, which was partially funded by Alcatel Lucent and partially funded by Reliance Industries. And I would run it to really help them, start, the creation of what they call, what is now Geo. It was called a bunch of other things prior to Geo, but that's what we started there under a joint venture infrastructure. Okay, so I get the benefit of still working for a Western company, but still, being pretty much allocated to this.
Yeah. And, I think we all have those moments, and I often ask people, when you have that sort of aha moment, I've got to think meeting Mukesh had to be one of those for you in your career, notwithstanding the success you had already enjoyed up until that point in your career. What was that visit with him like?
It was, and I'll tell you my next transition, with Robert Smith, which was another aha moment. I've had a few of these, which is kind of interesting. But with Mukesh, it was very interesting because we aligned so much from a vision perspective, that whether he was a, multi-billionaire or whether he was just another executive in the industry, I don't know how different it would have been, but just his thought process and his command of vision, was just one of the most unique things I had ever come across in the industry. I mean, there's something so special about him and how he looked at, business, how he looked at his country, how he looked, just the way he approached everything. And I appreciated that with him. I mean, at the time he was on the board of Bank of America. And him and I were talking about this, and he had gone to Stanford, but he never finished Stanford because his father pulled him back, before he could actually finish. And so we have these conversations, and he was on the board of Bank of America. And I remember him telling me, he says, Kenny, when I got on the board, I needed to go and understand how that business operated. So he studied and studied and studied and studied to understand exactly, kind of what drives the banking business, and specifically Bank of America. And he gave a little critique of the other board members. He said, I don't think that either of these other board members have studied the way or really understand how the company works. And their notion of an issue hits their lap is, let's go create a committee to go study it and bring back recommendations, and we look at those recommendations and do it. He's like, I don't want a committee. I need to understand it myself. And so, he was not only a visionary, but he also, was probably one of the strongest operators that I've ever run across in my entire life, right? So you have on one end, you typically, you run across people that are, kind of I call head in the clouds, but their feet aren't connected to the ground. I mean, his head was in the clouds, but his feet were so planted on the ground, it was amazing. So he could play both ends of the spectrum, which was so unique to me. I mean, I've dealt with executives before that will be in one or the other or right in the middle. I mean, but never that can kind of span, that whole spectrum. And that was intriguing to me. So working with him, was one of the most interesting things I've done in my career. I mean, just some of the things I learned from him, just being in that environment for that period of time. You learn this Western management style and approach, and you get there, and some of it's applied, but there's so many other management approaches that you learn from that environment. One example I'll give you, in India, it's all about ARPU. You have low revenue per client. So, you don't get $50, $100 per month revenue from, the Indian market. It's just they can't afford that. You're getting, $5 to $10, if that, okay? And so your cost of goods becomes extremely important, okay? In a world like that, much more important than it is in Western Europe or in the US. And so his idea was, how do I build an infrastructure that gives me the lowest cost of goods profile out there? And I will be willing to invest millions in the planning and architecture work to make sure the output is the most efficient thing going forward, because my real money is in scaling this business. And so he actually had multiple competing entities going on in the planning and architecture side. And most Western management styles would say, hey, that's duplicative, that's inefficient. And his idea was, okay, I'm spending a few million in each one, or whatever I'm spending in each one. That's irrelevant, because I actually want the best idea coming from each of these three, and I'm going to go with the one that gives me the best profile moving forward, and that's just sunk cost, because I can replace that. I can't replace an inefficient architecture I scale across India. And I look at it and I said, yeah, that is the logical way of pursuing that kind of strategy. Is why American company would just have one group designing it. Whatever the output is, you go run with it and be happy with it. You have no idea there's an alternative that could be much stronger, but you didn't have the other group looking at it. So those sort of things were very interesting working for him. And but boy, they work hard. They work we work 6 days a week. There's a 6-day work week in India for true native Indian companies. If you're a multinational, you work five days a week, but a true Indian companies work 6 days a week. And then at day 7, he'd invite you over to the cricket match, the Mumbai Indians. You go to a cricket match, which was, I learned cricket, not playing it, but just watching it. And then, he'd have tea at his house afterwards, which was basically an operations review. So day 7 was also, leverage on his side. So you work really hard, but it was a great experience. I'd do it again in a heartbeat.
Yeah. Wow. I could talk so much more about that experience. I've got to get to the next segment in your career. So take us through what happens after you've done this fantastic work in Mumbai, had this great experience. What leads to that next transition for you?
So I'm in Europe still, jumping back and forth to Mumbai. A good friend of mine kept wanting me to get introduced to these guys at Vista. He says, Kenny, you got to understand the private equity world. You're doing all these great things in large, multinationals, but you got to understand this. And I think you have the personality, for it with what you've done. And so it literally took a year for me to finally meet them. And I wasn't motivated. I just wasn't motivated. I looked at private equity as, at the time of, companies would go, saddle companies with a bunch of debt, take a bunch of cash out, exploit the company, do a bunch of financial engineering. And that's just not where my heart and passion was. And so I ended up going and meeting one of them in a chance meeting in London, and found out their model was the exact opposite of what I anticipated. It was all around operational value creation, and going into companies and improving companies, driving, updating their strategy, updating their execution, updating their processes and their systems, and their efficiency, and improving these companies, selling them at a much higher clip than what you bought them for, making a bunch of money in the process, but creating better companies. And I fell in love with that model. I didn't know that existed. And you go from these bigger companies that are highly bureaucratic, and the decision making takes months and quarters instead of days and weeks. And I remember some of that during my startup days, where I just loved that, moving very, very quick, in my startup days, when I went to DC, and kind of lost it when I go to the bigger companies, and wanted some of that again. And the private equity world kind of seemed like the perfect, balance between, okay, it's very entrepreneurial, but it at least it has customers, and it has a different risk profile than what I dealt with in '99 at the startup. And so kind of got caught up with them, went and started getting to know more of those players. And then they introduce me to Robert Smith. I go down to Austin and meet a bunch of their principals and go into Robert Smith's office. And him and I hit it up. By the way, he actually had a similar experience to mine. He was one of the only other people in my life that I've met that also did an internship at Bell Laboratories from the time they were a sophomore in high school through college. And on the same scholarship program that I was on, I had no idea who he was, but he's but he did it out of the Denver area. But I mean, just that connection even hits. So that was kind of like serendipity, right? I mean, how many people in the world had gone through that, as we talked about earlier? And so he started his career at Bell Labs before going off to Goldman Sachs and a bunch of other stuff. And really, him and I hit it off tremendously. I mean, just I didn't know I was ready to leave Alcatel at the time, but after having that conversation and seeing what he was doing, this was very early. He hadn't gotten the name that he has now.
What year is this?
This was 2011. Yeah, so this is pretty early. I mean, he has his own story, but I mean, he didn't have the public image that he has now. I mean, that's something that's been really more in the last 5 years. We got to know him and went and he talked me into moving. There's two companies at the time that he thought I would do really well in, given my international experience. One was a company called Aptean, and the other was a company called Mysis. And said, hey, why don't you come? The conversation actually was, my kids were still in high school, and I told them I couldn't move back to the States right now because my kids had made so many sacrifices for my career that I felt I owed it to them to at least finish high school and then go off, and then I'd be open to a move. And he accepted that, actually appreciated it. And then I get a call 2 weeks later and said, how about you stay in Paris, but take one of these roles as kind of the number 2 guy at one of these 2 companies, get to know the ropes of how we do private equity. And then when you can come back to the States, then we will get you going on your own company that we're always constantly buying and selling. And so I did, he talked me into doing it. I went up working for a company called Aptean, which was actually based in Atlanta, but still was I was based in France, and we had about half of our business overseas anyway. So I ran the international division and all the operations. And then when my kids graduated, transitioned from Aptean and went to a company called Kibo, which we had just bought 3 companies. So just since 2011, now I'm on my 3rd, private equity company, not with Vista, but with another private equity firm, but did 2 with Vista. Really understood the ropes with Vista. It just is a great experience. When I think I'm the only African American CEO that Vista has ever had, actually. Maybe they've done something recently, but just a really good group. Learned a lot through that experience, and kind of got me into another world. So it's the 3rd world I've been in. I went from bigger company to startup to private equity, fast-paced private equity environment, and we'll probably never leave the private equity environment. Just I love it. It's so nimble. It changes every day. You're constantly rebuilding teams, rebuilding process, rebuilding infrastructure. I just love that world, and it's something you can monetize very, very differently than you can in traditional companies as well.
Yeah. So, with your experience now, I'm glad you brought up the point about even Vista only having had you as an African American CEO. There's a dearth of obviously we're living in the times that we're living in now, and so everyone seems woke to things that so many of us have been observing for years, and sort of heeding the call and finally seeing that in technology as a whole, and I'd say really in most industries, when you look at investment banking, private equity, you name it, it's almost like we just don't exist in those worlds. And which is in part what's, spurred on and inspired having this podcast, is to share those stories. What's your viewpoint on how do we start to sort of stand that tide and shift the narrative and help Black folks understand that they too can get in the tech world and there's a space for them?
Yeah, I think, there's a tech world, and then there's, different forms of tech world, right? I mean, you talk about private equity, you talk about kind of the Googles, the Facebooks, and, all the Silicon Valley, stuff that's going on. And then you have more of the traditional, tech space, or even the IT space in so many companies that's becoming, critical. I think, I always look at it as, and you always hearken to your own experience, is how do you get the light bulb turned on in us? Right. The light bulb got turned on in me early in my life, and it never went out. Okay. And, I don't think it's something that is as tactical as just, okay, you're in college, let's go get a bunch of people there. I mean, it's, you got to go early, into, our kids' life and kind of make them feel okay to get into this arena. And sure. Both engineers, I mean, you said you're, biotech. I mean, you didn't just start that in college. I mean, there was something that happened far before college that kind of, got you into that area that allowed that to happen. And that's what, I mean, there's a lot of fields you don't have to do that in, but I think in the engineering field, it starts very, very early. And unfortunately, there's just systemic things that it's us and it's, the environment, both, don't necessarily help, create a situation where, we just don't get attracted to those fields, socially or any other reason. So we got to go fix that first and foremost. And I think that's a lot of us that need to go ahead and do that, right? We need to go invest in programs that, make it exciting. There's a partner of mine down in New Orleans, Calvin Mackey, who does, and you're probably a good one for you to chat with as well, that has a STEM New Orleans program. He's kind of bringing it all over the country. And he told me the story where he's doing this STEM experiment behind a school that it took him a month to get authorization to do. And there's this chain link fence, and there's a football team, and all the kids in the STEM had these little jackets, little lab coats and all that kind of stuff. And by the time it was all done, all the football players were sitting on the fence looking at the kids with the lab coats, as opposed to the opposite of the kids with lab coats looking at the kids playing football. And I mean, that's kind of the problem. How do we turn that around? And I said, so that's one. Second, is we have traditionally kind of taken even those that have gotten into engineering have taken conservative routes once we're in there, right? I mean, so I think that there needs to be a lot of mentorship and development of those that do decide to take the field, to sit there and say, you don't need to just stop at, kind of the entry level position or the position right after the entry level position. There's so much opportunity in this space. How do you cultivate that, talent that does arrive to go and do some pretty aggressive things and start moving the needle? I mean, getting into, private equity, the opportunities in private equity, I had no exposure to them, but by accident, right? And I'm sitting there at a pretty high level within the industry at the time, and had really no exposure to it. And so I think there's a lot of that, going on, that needs to happen, as well. And then I think the industry as a whole has a responsibility, right? I mean, and that's what's so interesting about this time, and that, diversity has always been labeled, the last 15, 20 years as gender diversity. All the diversity programs were gender diversity programs, which were very different than what it was in the 80s and 90s. But now this period, it allows us to really look at these things a little differently and start addressing, some of these opportunities. So, some of the things we got to do ourselves, and some of the things now the industry is kind of, creating an awareness that they need to go ahead and do as well. And so The problem is, though, the industry is not going to, I mean, no matter how benevolent they are, if there's not enough of us sitting there knocking on the door trying to get in, they're not going to go and look, play the long game and try to develop it over 10 or 15 years. That's not going to happen. They're going to be very, opportunistic. And so, we got to be ready for that opportunity. And so we got to work on the things that we need to do as the people to kind of get there. And then they start pushing the right buttons to take advantage of that. Is how I see it.
What advice would you offer to a 20 or 30-year-old version of yourself?
I think the one piece of advice that I always like to give when I talk to younger people is never get complacent. I mean, if I were to look at one common thread of my evolution, I just call it evolution. It's that there's always these forks in the road that presented themselves, and very often I took probably the least comfortable one because it changed so much, professionally and personally. But it's the one that allowed me to grow the most. If you understand what I mean. And if I had taken the conservative path, it could have been successful, but it probably wouldn't have, allowed me to grow the way I did. And so I think when you're early in your career, 20s and 30s, the objective, can't be where can I go make another $5,000 or $10,000. The objective is where can I, get exposed, in the most rich way possible, because that $5,000 or $10,000 when you're 20 is irrelevant when you're 40, 50, and able to leverage the experience you have and the return on investment there. So you're going to make your money in the 40s, in your 40s and your 50s. You're not going to make it all in your 20s. So prioritize exposure, early in your career, because you'll be able to take full advantage of that, later in your career. Is one, and part of that is taking those chances. Going and taking manageable risk. I always have this thing. It's like, okay, when you're walking across a little river or something, there's rocks there. You keep one foot on something solid that is solid, but then reach out with your other and kind of see, okay, is that rock going to move or not? And if it does move, okay, you can kind of shift your body weight back. But but take some chances. Get out there. Keep pushing the envelope on that early on. The more you do it, the better you're going to be.
Yeah. One way that I put it is you learn more from your stumbles or your failures than you do from when things work out. And so you've stated it real nicely. Taking the path of least resistance isn't it's convenient at the time, but in the big picture, I couldn't agree more. Taking that less travel path and taking some risk, it's all part of the game. Another thing I'd ask about mentorships. What are your thoughts about mentors? How do people secure mentors, and can you make a distinction between mentorships and mentors and perhaps sponsors?
I think that most mentors, should position themselves as sponsors as well. I mean, you don't need to be some people say the sponsor is somebody in your organization, right? Like different, you can have a mentor anywhere, but a sponsor is somebody that can help look out for you within the organization at a high enough level. The way I look at it, sponsors, can exist anywhere, because you shouldn't limit yourself to, the place at work you're at right now. I mean, you're mentoring somebody. They should understand you. They should understand what your interests are. I mean, I mentor people right now. I've been, talking. I'm on the board of the USC Business School, and I told the dean, I said, I only want to talk to underrepresented minorities. Those are the only mentees that I want. I don't want to be, dismissive. But I know that they need, what I have, and I've been talking to a number of them, and I talk to them about where they're working, but I also talk to them about, what those opportunities are, and create I call it the hookups, right? I mean, all of us had a hookup at anybody that has gotten to our level, there's multiple hookups in their lives that they were able to take advantage of. And I'm not too proud to say that I, took advantage of some of those as well. How can I offer them to somebody else? I have a big network here. I mean, so, if I see you're trying to do this and I really feel strongly about what you're capable of doing, then I will shift that from a mentorship, hey, let me advise, into let me try to set up, okay, the opportunity, for you to advance what it is you're trying to do inside or outside of your company. So I think that's just a big piece that, we as a people, because of kind of, how we've, traversed the industry and have had to leverage it. I mean, just like anything else, I think we have just a natural instinct to want to do that and give back. And so it's as important to me to mentor people as it is to do everything else I do in my life. Right. I mean, I'm probably more proud of, that person that's now a VP of, product development at, company X. And I remember them when they were just, an individual contributor, than I have anything else I've ever done. You know what I mean? I mean that, because it's almost like your own kids, right? I mean, I don't want to patronize it, but it's just, you get that in return. And I think that's just, something that I don't think we need to tell ourselves we need to do more of it, because I think we just naturally do it. It's good about it.
Your career took you all over the world, and oftentimes you had to lug your family along with you. How essential was the support of family through this process?
Yeah, I mean, my wife actually has a master's in computer science as well. And so, she took the journey to Bell South with me from AT&T Bell Labs. We met as interns at Bell Labs, actually. And when I went and we left Atlanta and moved to DC, that was the time we looked at each other, because we had, I think we were having we had our third kid at the time. And we just said, okay, we got to make a priority call here in terms of how we raise our kids. And my wife stopped working then, late 99, and made that sacrifice to kind of focus on our kids. Had no idea financially how we were going to do it, but it worked out, when you're used to, two incomes. But it did work out. It was one of the best decisions. I mean, I thank her every day. I know she sacrificed a lot. She sees what I'm doing, but, she had her dreams as well. And that's kind of hard sometimes, and you really think about it. But I think as she looks at, kind of the value that she was able to bring to our kids, it's a decision we make over and over again every single time. And so, family is everything. I mean, I do, everything I do right now. I tell my kids this, I can be penniless as long as they're taken care of. That's just how we operate. We have a very tight-knit family, and they've been supportive throughout this, and they've also had some great experiences. And even some of the decisions I made, the move to France and other things, was a lot about giving them experiences as well. So they've seen the world with me. They're citizens of the world. They're not citizens of Texas. They actually struggled when they came back to Texas, because they thought the world was a little bit too small and shallow. So it's been a good ride. That's just, as you go through, a lot of tough times, I mean, you start realizing, and one thing I learned in Europe is you don't live to work, you work to live. So you got to have that balance. You don't have the balance. It's just, you're going to keep doing this and just fall over on the side one day, and everybody's going to forget you, and everybody's going to move on. I mean, you got to, it means so much more.
So what's on the horizon for you? What's your long-term big picture at this?
Wow. I love the private equity world, and I love what I do. I mean, and when I'm not doing it, I just, if I'm not moving the ball forward, I just get bored, quite frankly. And so probably do a couple more runs at this of good transformation opportunities, of companies. I'm starting to kind of tinker around with boards now, and but I still have too much operations in my blood. I still have too much energy to kind of get into pure advisory. People wanted to get me into advisory. Another role of private equity is kind of getting into an advisory capacity as an operating partner. Not really ready for that until some of that flame extinguishes a bit. So look at kind of doing that, and then kind of transitioning to kind of really add value in an advisory level, board and otherwise. It's kind of how I'd like to do it when I just don't have the same energy that I have today. So looking forward to that. But then the other thing is, as you talked about, is how how to develop the folks that are coming behind me. I'm not the young whippersnapper anymore that out there trying to change the world. I have a lot of experience, and how do I help others fast forward, their opportunities, through my experiences, and is how I look at it. So that's another big piece of what I want to go ahead and do.
So speaking of ushering people in behind you, what advice would you offer brothers who are trying to get into private equity, and then any closing remarks you might want to offer?
Okay. On the private equity side, study. I mean, get to know people that are there. It's now becoming a little bit of the, kind of the in thing to do, right? I mean, it's getting now, it's not what 10 years ago when I started getting into it, I didn't know that much about it, but now everybody, knows something about it, but it isn't for everybody. I mean, quite frankly, it's not for everybody. It's for, I always call it, there's a term that we use sometimes, which is, kind of a wartime general and a peacetime general. It's really for the wartime generals, right? I mean, it's the people that, okay, yes, they may have run big organizations before, but they're very capable of rolling up their sleeves and, getting in the details. If that's not who you are, you won't last a minute in private equity. I mean, you're sitting there taking teams that, don't have the depth that you're accustomed to in larger companies, and having to, go build it and turn it around, while you're still operating the business. And so it's very dynamic. It's very, it's very consuming, and it moves at a pace that, you're not accustomed to in larger companies. And so you got to make sure you understand that. And the rope, I call it the rope, the amount of flex you get is very little. I mean, if you're not delivering, it's move on to the next person, because you don't have time, to develop and kind of coordinate that way. So I think that, so just make sure you do your homework, make sure you get out to people to understand what that reality really is. And there's enough people in the field to be able to help that. And just from a closing remarks perspective, I probably went into details in this interview that I've never gotten into. And there's hundreds of other stories around other areas, but I think it's important to get these stories out. I mean, I love what you're doing, and there's a little nugget that people can get through all of these. That's very, very important, because these experiences, are great stories, and I mean, especially in the African American community, because they're unique. I mean, each one of these has a very unique element to them. And depending on how you run the interview, I mean, they can go down, so many different rabbit holes that, with just interesting, kind of sub stories to them that I think that needs to get out there more and more and more, what these experiences are, what the reality, what those realities are. So, I appreciate you giving me the time to tell a little bit of my story. And I hope you appreciate it. I hope the audience appreciates it.
They certainly do. It's been wonderful. I certainly appreciate you taking the time. I'm going to put in a shameless plug at some point. The audience wants to hear from Robert Smith. So I'm going to start sowing that seed and planting it with you. But this has been incredible, really taking us through this world that so few of us get a chance to see. And so I think it's definitely much appreciated. I've loved hearing about your story, your travels, and all that you've done through your career. You've talked to us about the importance of expanding your boundaries, taking risks, and study. My guest today has been Kenneth Frank. My name is Laolu Davies-Yemitan, and you've been listening to My Brother Podcast.